In 1931, a woman in Kentucky fed her family of 7 on 40 cents a day, not per person, total. She did it with bread, a jar of whatever she had canned the summer before, and the kind of stubbornness that does not show up in history books. Number 21 on this list was her invention. She never wrote it down. Her granddaughter remembered it 60 years later in a newspaper interview and could not finish the sentence without crying. Number 12 uses something that is sitting in your refrigerator right now that you have never once thought to put on bread. And number 1, the sandwich that an entire generation ate more than any other, has a story behind it that will change the way you think about the word meal. None of these came from a cookbook. All of them came from kitchens where giving up was not an option. Hit subscribe and let us count down 25 Depression-era sandwiches your grandmother never told you about. Number 25. The salt sandwich. 2 slices of bread and a shake of salt. When there was truly nothing in the kitchen, no butter, no lard, no condiment of any kind, salt gave bread enough flavor to swallow. A box of Morton's salt cost about 3 cents in 1932 and lasted for months. Mothers dampened the bread slightly with water so the salt would stick, creating a surface that tasted like the ghost of something real. The salt sandwich appears in oral histories from the Dust Bowl, from Appalachian mining towns, and from black neighborhoods in Chicago and Detroit, where the Depression hit first and left last. It was not a recipe. It was the line between eating and not eating. Nobody who grew up on salt sandwiches ever wasted food again for the rest of their lives. Number 24. The gravy bread sandwich, not the drippings from a roast. That was for families who still had meat. This gravy was flour, water, and grease, whatever grease was available, saved bacon fat, or the scrapings from yesterday's skillet. It was mixed in a hot pan until it thickened into a pale, lumpy sauce that tasted like salt and smoke and not much else. Poured hot over bread, it turned a dry slice into something warm and heavy enough to stop the shaking in a child's hands. In the Ozarks, they called it poor man's gravy. In East Texas, they called it sawmill gravy. In every case, it cost less than a penny per serving, and it kept families upright when there was nothing else to stand on. The gravy was never good. It was always enough. Number 23. The jelly sandwich. Just jelly and bread. No peanut butter. No butter. Just whatever preserve or jelly was on the shelf, spread thick to make 2 slices of bread feel like a meal. Grape jelly was the cheapest, about 10 cents a jar in 1934, and it had enough sugar to give a child energy for a few hours. Families who canned their own fruit in summer had strawberry, blackberry, or apple jelly that cost them nothing but labor. A jelly sandwich in a school lunch pail told a teacher everything about what was happening at home. Some teachers kept extra bread in their desk drawers for the children whose jelly sandwiches were getting thinner by the week. Nobody talked about it. The teachers just did it, and the children just ate, and the silence between them was its own kind of kindness. Number 22. The fried egg and onion sandwich. When a family kept backyard chickens and grew onions in the garden, this sandwich cost literally nothing. 1 egg fried in a slick of grease with a handful of diced onions scattered in the pan. The onions softened and browned in the egg's fat, sweetening as it cooked. Slid onto bread with salt and pepper, the yolk breaking through and soaking into the slice underneath. This was the working man's sandwich, the one that went into the lunch pail on mornings when there was just enough to make something hot. The onions stretched a single egg into something that felt substantial. 1 egg alone between bread was thin. 1 egg with onion was a meal. That difference mattered when a man was laying railroad ties for 12 hours and dinner was 8 miles and a long walk away. Number 21. The cottage cheese and chive sandwich. Cottage cheese was homemade in Depression kitchens. Sour milk was heated gently until it curdled. The curds were strained through cheesecloth and salted. It cost nothing because it was made from milk that had already gone bad, milk that in better times would have been poured down the drain. Mixed with chopped chives from the garden and spread on bread, it became a sandwich with real protein, calcium, and a fresh flavor that cut through the heaviness of a bread-based diet. Farm wives were especially good at this, timing the souring of the milk to have fresh cottage cheese every few days. The sandwich was cool and light, the opposite of the heavy, starchy survival food that dominated most depression meals. It tasted like someone had time to care about what the food actually tasted like. In kitchens where every other meal was an act of desperation, the cottage cheese sandwich was an act of dignity. Number 20. The sardine sandwich. A tin of sardines cost about 5 cents in 1933. 5 cents for 6 or 7 whole fish packed in oil, providing protein, fat, and calcium from the soft, edible bones. Mashed onto bread with a squeeze of lemon if you had one, or just eaten straight from the tin laid on a slice. The oil from the can soaked into the bread and served as the butter that was not there. Sardine sandwiches were common in immigrant communities, Italian, Portuguese, and Greek, where canned fish was a familiar comfort rather than a last resort. In other households, the strong smell was a barrier. Children who ate sardine sandwiches at school learned quickly not to open their lunch pails near anyone else. The smell announced poverty in a way that other sandwiches did not, but the nutrition was undeniable. Doctors in public health clinics during the 1930s quietly recommended sardines as the cheapest way to keep children's bones growing when milk money had run out. Number 19. The radish sandwich. Thinly sliced radishes on buttered bread with a generous shake of salt. This was a European tradition that German, American, Polish, and Czech immigrants brought to America and relied on heavily during the Depression. Radishes grew fast, sometimes ready to pull in 3 weeks, and they grew in poor soil that would not support other vegetables. The peppery bite of the radish against the fat of the butter created a combination that was sharp, clean, and surprisingly satisfying. A packet of radish seeds cost a penny. A single planting could produce enough radishes for weeks of sandwiches. In Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and St. Louis, cities with large German-American populations, the radish sandwich was as common as the peanut butter sandwich was everywhere else. It was the immigrants' answer to the same question every American family was asking in 1933. What can I put between bread that costs almost nothing and tastes like something? Number 18. The lettuce sandwich. A few leaves of iceberg lettuce on bread with mayonnaise and salt. That was the entire sandwich. Lettuce was cheap when it was in season, and a single head could make sandwiches for days. The crunch of cold lettuce against soft bread gave the sandwich a texture that tricked the mouth into thinking there was more substance than there was. The mayo added fat and calories. The salt made it taste deliberate rather than desperate. Women who served lettuce sandwiches to their families called them salad sandwiches because naming it after just the lettuce felt too bare, too close to admitting what it really was. In the South, the lettuce was sometimes wilted first in hot bacon grease, turning it dark and soft and smoky. That version was closer to a real meal, but it required bacon grease, and bacon grease required bacon, and bacon required money that might not be there. Number 17. The honey sandwich. A drizzle of honey between 2 slices of bread. Families who kept bees or knew someone who did had access to a sweetener that required no purchase and no ration. Honey was the original free food, gathered by insects, stored in wax, and harvested with nothing but a veil and a smoker. On bread, honey soaked in slowly, saturating the crumb with a sweetness that was deeper and more complex than sugar. The flavor changed with the season. Spring honey tasted like clover. Late summer honey carried wildflower and goldenrod, Every jar was different, and every sandwich made from it carried the specific taste of a specific place. Honey sandwiches were also medicine. Mothers gave them to children with sore throats and coughs, and the honey coated and soothed in a way that no pharmacy product of the era could match. The honey sandwich was food, medicine, and comfort wrapped in bread that cost a penny a slice. Number 16. The fried mush sandwich. Cornmeal mush was cooked thick the night before and poured into a loaf pan to set in the icebox overnight. In the morning it was sliced into slabs and fried in lard until the outside was golden and crunchy, while the inside stayed warm and creamy. That fried slab went between two slices of bread, sometimes with nothing else, sometimes with a drizzle of syrup or a smear of apple butter. A pound of cornmeal cost about 4 cents. The mush was dinner. The fried mush sandwich was breakfast. That's how depression families doubled the value of every ingredient. Cook it once, serve it twice, waste nothing. The fried mush sandwich disappeared when boxed cereals took over the American breakfast. But the people who remember it will tell you that nothing from a box ever had that same crispy, corny, hot from the skillet weight that made a morning feel possible. Number 15. The dandelion green sandwich. Dandelion greens picked from the yard, wilted in a pan with vinegar and a little bacon fat, then piled onto bread. During the Depression, foraging was not a lifestyle choice. It was grocery shopping for people who had no grocery money. Dandelions grew everywhere, free and abundant, and the young leaves were tender enough to eat raw, though most families cooked them to cut the bitterness. The vinegar dressing was a southern and Appalachian tradition that turned the greens sour and savory, cutting through the mineral taste of the leaves. A dandelion green sandwich was entirely free if you already had bread and a splash of vinegar. In cities, women and children picked dandelions from vacant lots and public parks, filling paper sacks with leaves that would become dinner. The sight of a woman picking dandelions in a city park in 1933 meant exactly one thing, and everyone who saw her knew it. Number 14. The molasses sandwich. In the South, where sorghum molasses was pressed locally and sold for pennies a gallon, the molasses sandwich was breakfast, lunch, and sometimes supper. Dark, thick, bittersweet molasses spread on bread, sometimes with butter, sometimes without. The flavor was intense, earthy, and almost smoky, nothing like the clean sweetness of sugar. Children either loved it or hated it. There was no middle ground with molasses. A gallon cost about 20 cents in rural Alabama in 1934 and lasted a family of 6 for 2 weeks. Molasses also carried iron, calcium, and potassium in concentrations that modern nutritionists find remarkable for something that was treated as a cheap sweetener. The molasses sandwich quietly prevented anemia in thousands of Southern children whose diets otherwise contained almost no iron at all. Their mothers did not know the science. They knew the sandwich. The science caught up decades later. Number 13. The tomato gravy sandwich. Not tomato sauce, tomato gravy. Canned tomatoes, home canned or store-bought at about 8 cents a can, were cooked down in a skillet with a spoonful of flour and a little grease until the mixture thickened into a rusty, tangy gravy. Poured over bread or ladled between 2 slices, it was the Appalachian and Southern substitute for meat gravy on the weeks when there was no meat. The acidity of the tomato gave it a brightness that flour and water gravy could not match. The flour gave it body. A single can of tomatoes made enough gravy for a family of 4. In the mountains of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, tomato gravy on bread was served so often that some families ate it every single day for months. It was monotonous. It was also enough. Number 12. The pickle relish sandwich. A jar of sweet pickle relish spread on bread. That was the whole thing. Relish cost about 10 cents a jar and contained vinegar, sugar, and enough vegetable matter to feel like it qualified as food. Spread on bread, the sweetness and acidity gave the sandwich more flavor per bite than most other single ingredient options on this list. Women who canned their own relish from garden cucumbers had it in abundance. The relish sandwich showed up in school lunch pails across the country, nestled next to the jelly sandwiches and the mayonnaise sandwiches, all of them telling the same quiet story about what was and was not in the kitchen that morning. Nobody chose relish as a sandwich filling. It was chosen by the absence of everything else. But the sweet and sour crunch of it on soft bread was better than it had any right to be. Number 11. The liver sausage sandwich. Liverwurst, or liver sausage as most families called it, cost about 12 cents a pound in the 1930s and stretched further than any other deli meat because the flavor was so strong that you needed very little per sandwich. A thin spread on rye bread with a squirt of yellow mustard was a complete sandwich that tasted like you had spent more than you had. German American and Eastern European families ate liverwurst sandwiches as a matter of course, not as a Depression adaptation, but as a continuation of old country habits that happened to be perfectly suited for hard times. The iron content was extraordinary. The protein was real. The flavor, smooth, mineral-rich, faintly gamey, was polarizing. People either grew up loving it or grew up dreading the smell of the opened package. Liverwurst sandwiches declined after the war as American tastes shifted toward milder, blander processed meats. The sandwich that had the most nutrition was replaced by the ones that had the least. Number 10. The sugar and cream sandwich. In dairy country, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Iowa, where cream was sometimes cheaper than butter because it was harder to store and sell, families poured heavy cream onto bread and sprinkled it with sugar. The cream soaked into the bread like milk into cake, and the sugar dissolved into the wet surface, creating something that tasted like an unbaked pastry. This was a farm sandwich. Families that kept dairy cows had cream that would spoil if it was not used, and during the Depression, selling cream at market brought less money than it cost to transport, so the cream went on bread. The sugar and cream sandwich was rich, cold, sweet, and unlike anything else on this list, because it came not from deprivation, but from an excess of one thing and a shortage of everything else. Number 9. The butter and pepper sandwich. Bread, butter, and a heavy crank of black pepper. Nothing else. The pepper turned a plain butter sandwich into something with heat and bite, and an almost savory depth that sugar never provided. Black pepper cost about 15 cents for a small tin in 1933, and it lasted for months because you only needed a few turns of the grinder per sandwich. This was the version that men preferred. Too plain for children, too sharp for a sweet tooth, but exactly right for a working adult who wanted bread to taste like more than bread without wasting anything precious. The butter and pepper sandwich appears in personal diaries and letters from the Depression with surprising frequency, always mentioned matter-of-factly, never with complaint. It was the sandwich that didn't ask for sympathy. It just fed you and moved on. Number 8. The hot milk toast. Not technically a sandwich in the traditional sense, it was served between meals and eaten with hands as often as with a spoon. Bread was toasted until firm, placed in a shallow bowl, dotted with butter, then covered with hot milk that had been salted and peppered. The toast softened under the milk, the butter melted into pools on the surface, and the whole thing became a warm, sodden, deeply comforting dish eaten with a spoon until the toast fell apart and was then drunk from the bowl like soup. Doctors prescribed hot milk toast for the sick. Mothers made it for children who could not sleep. Grandmothers ate it alone at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. It cost about 4 cents per serving. It required 3 minutes of effort, and it provided the kind of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Hot milk toast has disappeared from every American cookbook. It should not have. Number 7. The creamed pea sandwich. Canned peas, about 7 cents a can in 1934, were heated in a white sauce made from flour, milk, and butter, then spooned over toast or placed between 2 slices of bread. The peas were soft and sweet. The white sauce was thick and salty. Together on bread, they made a sandwich that was almost accidentally nutritious. The peas provided vitamins. The milk provided calcium. The flour and butter provided calories. This was a government-recommended meal published in USDA pamphlets aimed at families on relief. The pamphlet called it creamed peas on toast. The families who made it called it dinner. Nobody was confused about what it was. It was the cheapest way to put a hot, complete meal on the table using ingredients that were always available at the cheapest grocery on the block. Number 6. The brown sugar and butter sandwich. Brown sugar packed onto buttered bread, where it dissolved at the contact point between fat and sugar into something that tasted like the inside of a caramel. Dark brown sugar was better because its higher molasses content created a deeper, more complex sweetness that granulated white sugar could not touch. A 2-pound box of brown sugar cost about 9 cents in 1933. Combined with a scrape of butter on bread, it became the dessert sandwich that children begged for and mothers made without guilt because the alternative was no dessert at all. The brown sugar sandwich shows up in Depression-era oral histories from every region, every class, and every ethnicity. It was universal in a way that almost nothing else on this list was. Everyone, no matter where they came from, understood the combination of butter and brown sugar on bread. It was the common language of making something sweet when sweetness was the thing you could least afford. Number 5. The cold biscuit and sorghum sandwich. Leftover biscuits from breakfast, split open cold and filled with sorghum syrup that pooled in the cratered surface of the biscuit's interior. The biscuit absorbed the syrup slowly, turning soft and sticky, while the outer crust stayed dry enough to hold in your hand. In the rural South, where sorghum was pressed locally every autumn and biscuits were baked daily, this sandwich cost almost nothing and appeared between meals with the regularity of a clock. Field workers ate it at mid-morning. Children ate it after school. The biscuit and sorghum sandwich was so embedded in Southern life that families continued making it decades after the Depression ended. Not out of need, but out of a loyalty to flavor that no amount of prosperity could override. Number 4. The potted meat and cracker sandwich. Potted meat, the spreadable kind from a tiny tin half the size of your palm, cost about 5 cents in 1935. The taste was smoky, salty, and vaguely meaty in a way that did not reward close examination. Spread on bread, with crackers crumbled on top for texture, it became something surprisingly close to a real sandwich. The crackers added the crunch that the soft bread and smooth paste lacked. The combination of salt from the meat and salt from the crackers was aggressive enough to make the whole thing taste intentional rather than desperate. Factory workers and day laborers carried these sandwiches because they required no refrigeration, survived a hot lunch pail without spoiling, and cost so little that eating one did not mean skipping the next meal. The potted meat sandwich asked nothing of you except hunger. It always answered. Number 3. The oleo and sugar sandwich. Oleomargarine, the cheap butter substitute that arrived in blocks of white fat with a packet of yellow dye you kneaded in by hand, spread on bread and sprinkled with sugar. This was the sugar sandwich's poorer cousin, the version that existed in homes where even butter was beyond the budget. Oleo cost about 10 cents a pound in 1934, roughly a third the price of butter. The flavor was flatter, less rich, with a faintly chemical edge that no amount of sugar could fully hide. But children did not care. The sweetness was what mattered. The oleo was just the vehicle. Every neighborhood in working-class America had children who ate oleo and sugar sandwiches, and they called it by different names on every block. Some called it poor man's cake. Some called it hobo bread. Some did not call it anything at all because naming it meant thinking about what it really was. Whatever they called it, they ate it, and whatever they remember, They remember it was sweet. Number 2. The bread and drippings sandwich. After any meat was cooked, pork chops, chicken, or a cheap roast, the fat that rendered into the bottom of the pan was saved. It was poured into a jar, cooled to a soft solid, and spread on bread with salt. The drippings carried the concentrated flavor of whatever animal they came from. Pork drippings tasted porky and rich. Chicken drippings were lighter, with a golden color and a clean, savory flavor. Beef drippings were dark and intense. Every jar was different because every jar was the ghost of a specific meal. Families that could only afford meat once or twice a week kept the drippings going for days, spreading them on bread to make the memory of Sunday dinner last until Wednesday. A bread and dripping sandwich was not a substitute for meat. It was the echo of meat. And in the kitchens of the Depression, echoes were sometimes all you had. Number 1. The sleep sandwich. This is the one nobody talks about. There was no bread. There was nothing to put between bread, even if there had been. So mothers put children to bed early and told them that sleep was supper. Go to sleep and you won't be hungry. That was the meal. Not a sandwich at all, but the absence of one. The moment when every recipe had been exhausted, every jar scraped clean, every trick on this entire list used up. The sleep sandwich appeared in Depression-era oral histories, in sociological studies, in the quiet confessions of elderly men and women who remembered being put to bed at 5 in the afternoon and understanding, even as children, exactly why. Their mothers were not cruel. Their mothers were out of options. Sleep was the only thing in the house that cost nothing and filled the hours until morning, when something might come through. A neighbor's charity, a day job, a line at the relief office. The sleep sandwich is the last entry on this list because it is the reason every other entry exists. Every onion sandwich, every mustard sandwich, every smear of lard and shake of salt was a mother's attempt to make sure her family never arrived at the place where the only thing left to serve was darkness and a prayer. That is what Depression-era cooking really was, not recipes. Refusal. The absolute refusal to let that night come one day sooner than it had to. Make one of these this week. The jelly sandwich on good bread, the radish sandwich with real butter and coarse salt, the brown sugar sandwich that tastes like caramel for 4 cents. Then call your grandmother if you still can and ask her what she ate when she was small. Listen to the pause before she answers. That pause holds everything. Because these were never just sandwiches. They were the distance between a family that made it and one that did not. And somebody in your family made it, or you would not be here to read this.